All right, my dear BIBLEin365 brothers and sisters, we have arrived at the book of 1 Corinthians. And folks, this is an incredible letter. Now, on the different generations of my summaries of the book of 1 Corinthians, I can't help but to continue to say the same things that I've been saying. But I want to try to take a slightly different approach here because what I hope it will do is help you to be able to get a more practical understanding of how to use this book in order for you to get the most out of it. Now, one thing I should note right away, because if you understand this, then it will also be able to better help you understand why the book is the way it is. Now, of course, we call it a book, but this is Paul's letter to the church in Corinth. And as he writes the letter, there are so many historical things that you should be considering. By the way, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it, if at all, because in my summary of Acts, I talk about it. In my Bible teaching through the book of Corinthians, I spend a lot of time talking about it, especially in my intro and survey. And I also spend a lot of time talking about it in my previous summaries of the book of 1 Corinthians. It would be a good idea to go to jamescadis.com and pull my older studies on the book of 1 Corinthians where I talk about all this stuff, and it will better enhance and help your understanding of the word. And that's, of course, if you want it to be a little bit more in-depth and a lot more insightful with respect to every specific detail that we can find in each chapter. Also, you can go to my previous summaries that I have done of 1 Corinthians for BIBLEin365 where I cover a lot of that stuff. Now, this is what you need to know for the purposes of what I'm doing in this specific video. And that's this. When Paul was writing to the church in Corinth, it was not like many of the other letters that he has written. As a matter of fact, if you stop for a moment to examine the content of 1 Corinthians, you'll realize very quickly that what the Apostle Paul is doing is actually very unique in that it appears as though the elders had gone to him, elders from Corinth, who had given him a whole bunch of questions about some serious issues that they were dealing with in the church. And the Apostle Paul is kind of like going right down the line, answering those questions as though he was just going question number one, question number two, question number three. And although he doesn't write question number one, question number two, question number three, the format of the letter very much appears as though he is just answering one question after the other. If you were to try to look at it any other way, then the book wouldn't make much sense because it feels as though there's not a lot of continuity to it. But when you begin to look at it the way that Paul actually wrote it, then you will find an extraordinary amount of continuity. Now, why is that important? I believe that the book of 1 Corinthians literally goes over virtually anything that will come up in the church as a result of human nature. And by the way, it doesn't even have to be in the church. It can be outside of the church. It could be with people that aren't walking with God, that don't know God. But the reality of it is, so many of the issues that the Apostle Paul deals with are covered very effectively here in the book of 1 Corinthians. And the book of 1 Corinthians can be used as an extraordinary manual for how you build everything from governments to classrooms to families to businesses. You can find virtually any answer that you could possibly want on any of these issues in this book alone. And it is absolutely wonderful when you stop to consider what it looks like and how the format actually works. So let's get into this really quickly because I want to go over all of the chapters. Again, I'm not going to get into the city of Corinth and some of the other things that related to Paul's missionary journey when he got there and so on and so forth. Let's just get into many of the issues that these chapters deal with. First of all, when you get into chapter 1, you are dealing with lots of different divisions that were taking place in the church. And chapter 1 actually goes to deal with that in a very, very specific and a very, very powerful way. Because keep in mind, there were no real central meeting places of the church that especially was in these areas of Asia Minor, actually nowhere, quite frankly. And the reality of it is, because there were multitudes of Christians that were in Corinth and there was no real organization to the things that were happening, it created a lot of factions. And the reality of it was there were different people who lived in different ways, who had different backgrounds, And they didn't always get along. Like, for example, you had the Greeks, who were the type of people who were oftentimes known as being the very intellectual individuals and were very proud of their intellectualism, where you had other people that weren't really that way. You had other people who were more philosophically bent. And then there were other people who were just all about living the pleasurous life, right? But the reality of it is, they all began to divide over a series of issues, and 1 Corinthians chapter 1 right away deals with some critical issues that helps you to be able to better understand how to deal with division. And it's really cool because when you get into chapter 2, it flows when he starts to answer questions regarding the issue of wisdom and seeking wisdom and understanding what kind of wisdom you should be seeking. So if you want to pursue the wisdom of God, that's where you get into chapter 2. And quite frankly, understand Paul makes a very unique distinction, and that is God's wisdom is not the world's wisdom. And the things that he talks about in that chapter are really important. When you get into chapter 3, there is a reminder that you have to understand that the church belongs to God. And if the church belongs to God, then that means we as the church belong to him, and we ought to be listening to the things that he tells us to understand and know his purposes for us. And that's very, very important. When we get into chapter 4, Paul speaks a little bit about himself and explains why he himself is qualified to do the things that he has done. He speaks about the people that he had an impact on. And these are very important things when you begin to caution church leaders to not teach beyond the very things that are written. You see, Paul says, look, I'm about as qualified as anybody could be in any of these areas, and I'm telling you, stick to the Bible. Don't go beyond the Bible. And that's what you get in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Now, when we get into chapter 5, it's a very ugly situation. This is where we touch up on the issue of sexual promiscuity and incense, in this case, really ugly. Chapter 6 gets into lawsuits. How Christians should be dealing with lawsuits with one another and outside of the church. There's more discussion of promiscuity and immorality in chapter 6. So there's a lot of things that this covers. Chapter 7 deals with marriage. Chapter 8 deals with something that's really interesting. A lot of people will blow over chapter 8 and go, oh, it doesn't apply to me because of meat sacrificed to idols. But the reality of it is it has a lot to do with liberties we should or should not be taking. And then, of course, when you talk about chapter 9, it deals with something as simple that a lot of people might not think about as compensation and why that's actually important and what church leaders should be expected to be compensated with, or how they should be compensated and how we should be treating one another in the church. It's actually a really, really good thing. And then, of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, all throughout chapter 10 is a warning about walking away and serving false gods and the destructive effect that it can have in doing so. Of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is very controversial because it deals with the subject of women in the church. I don't see what's all controversial about it. I think it's very, very well put, and there's a lot of great insight there. You just have to understand what's being said. And then, of course, it deals with the subject of communion, which is a very widely untaught in many cases, and in some cases, actually incorrectly taught portion of 1 Corinthians. And so it's one that's important. And then, of course, 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and actually chapter 14 deal with the subject of spiritual gifts in some very specific ways. Chapter 13 is the love chapter, but it's still in context with spiritual gifts and how spiritual gifts ought to be used. And these are very important because when we talk about our role in the body of Christ, these chapters are awesome. And then, of course, when you get into chapter 15, you are dealing with the resurrection. And I love it. It's the resurrection chapter. And chapter 16, believe it or not, may end up being one of the most insightful chapters that you will find the Apostle Paul writing here, because it gives us information related to some very interesting circumstances of the Apostle Paul, gives us some insight into people like Apollos and other people like this. So there's a lot of stuff there. But folks, with all things said and done, this is the passage that you can make a manual from. This is the passage that can give you the guidance to structure anything, your family, your business, government, anything. It's all there. It's great stuff. And let me just say this. I'm very proud of you guys. I cannot believe that we are already in the month of August and you are continuing on and you are doing a great job. Keep fighting the good fight. Go for it. God is so good. And it is awesome to see his goodness in you. Keep fighting the good fight. And by the way, Q&A on the 30th. We're excited. 30th of August. It's going to be a good one. Get your questions ready. God bless you.